The sky over Earth turned dark on a Tuesday morning. It was not clouds. It was not an eclipse. It was 600 warships, each one the color of burnt metal, hanging in the atmosphere like dead things waiting to fall. The largest of them sat directly above the Atlantic Ocean, and it was so massive that people on the coastlines of 3 continents could see it without looking up. It simply was the sky now. The sun had become a memory, hidden behind alien steel. Every screen on the planet flickered at the same time. Every phone, every television, every billboard in every city on every continent displayed the same image. A tall, pale figure with deep-set black eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from gray stone. He wore robes of deep violet, and behind him stood rows of armored soldiers who did not move, did not blink, did not breathe in any way that looked natural. His name was High Arbiter Zorath Vel, and he spoke in a voice that had been translated into every human language simultaneously. "People of Earth," he said, "you have been assessed. Your species has been studied, measured, and classified by the standards of the Vorathian Dominion, which has governed this galaxy for 12,000 years. Based on your physical resilience, your biological adaptability, and your capacity for sustained labor under extreme conditions, you have been designated as Slave Category 7. Effective immediately, this planet and all human territories beyond it are the property of the Vorathian Dominion. Every man, woman, and child born of your species is now a resource of the Empire. Compliance is expected. Resistance is a mathematical impossibility." The screens returned to normal, and for about 90 seconds, the entire planet was completely silent. Then the screaming began. Governments scrambled. Emergency sessions were called in every capital. Military commanders pulled up orbital scans of the alien fleet and stared at them the way a man stares at the ocean when he realizes his boat has a hole in it. The numbers were not just bad, they were laughable. Earth's entire combined fleet, every warship, every frigate, every armed shuttle from every nation, would not have been enough to scratch the paint on one of those alien cruisers. Their weapons were plasma-based, their shields were energy barriers that could absorb a nuclear strike without flickering, and their ships moved faster than light. Humanity had none of these things. At a naval station near the Mars shipyards, a young captain named Danny Sutton sat in the command chair of his frigate, the Resolute, and read the decree on his datapad for the 3rd time. He was 34 years old, with a square jaw and calm brown eyes that did not match the tightness in his chest. Around him, his crew of 62 men and women were looking at him, waiting for him to say something. He put the datapad down and looked at them. "Nobody on this ship is anyone's property," he said quietly. "Not today, not ever." That was enough. His crew went back to their stations, and Danny Sutton began sending encrypted messages to every captain he trusted. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a research facility that did not officially exist, a woman named Dr. Laura Beckett read the same decree and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She was 41, tall and thin, with dark hair pulled back in a knot, and the kind of sharp, tired eyes that came from years of staring at equations that did not want to be solved. For 6 years, she had been working on a project the government called Too Dangerous, a way to manipulate energy at a frequency level that could theoretically disrupt any known form of shielding technology. The project had been underfunded, understaffed, and one budget review away from being canceled entirely. Laura picked up her phone and called the facility director. "I need everything," she said. "Every resource, every person, every dollar, and I need it by tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end. "Then, you'll have it by tonight." In Washington, in a bunker so far underground that the walls sweated, General Sam Hayworth sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by the most powerful military leaders on the planet. He was 58, built like a boulder, with gray hair cut short and a face that had seen enough war to know what it looked like when it was coming. The men and women around him were arguing. Some wanted to negotiate, some wanted to hide, some wanted to pray. Hayworth let them talk. He had already made his decision. The Varathians did not wait for an answer. On the third day after the decree, massive transport ships descended on major cities across the globe. They landed in parks, in stadiums, in open fields, and from them poured squads of Varathian soldiers, 8 feet tall, encased in black armor that hummed with energy. They carried long rifles that fired bolts of white-hot plasma, and they moved with the confidence of beings who had done this to 100 species before. They came to collect. In Chicago, a processing unit set up near Millennium Park began herding civilians into lines. Men, women, children, sorted, tagged, and directed toward the transport ships like cattle. Most people were too terrified to resist. The alien soldiers were enormous, and the sight of those plasma rifles was enough to freeze anyone's blood. But not everyone froze. A young sergeant named Kyle Brandt was off duty when the transports landed. He was 26, with red hair and freckles and a grin that his friends said made him look like he was always about to do something stupid. He was not grinning now. He watched from across the street as a Varathian soldier grabbed an old woman by the arm and shoved her toward a transport ramp. Kyle looked at the 11 soldiers in his squad, who had followed him out of instinct more than orders. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Kyle raised his rifle and fired. The bullet bounced off the Varathian's armor like a pebble off a tank. The alien turned, almost curious, and raised its plasma rifle. The return fire killed Kyle Brandt instantly. His squad opened up with everything they had: rifles, sidearms, grenades. They lasted 19 seconds. All 12 of them died in that park, and they did not take a single alien with them. But someone had been filming. Within an hour, the footage was everywhere. Kyle Brandt, 26 years old, firing a rifle at a monster 3 times his size, knowing it would not work, doing it anyway. The video did not show a victory. It showed something more dangerous. It showed that humans would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The world watched, and something changed in the eyes of 8 billion people. 2 days later, General Sam Hayworth stood before the combined leadership of every nation on Earth. The room was packed, the air was thick, and every face was pale with fear. Hayworth did not give a speech. He played the footage of Kyle Brandt's last 19 seconds, and then he turned off the screen and looked at the room. "They want to put chains on 8 billion people," he said. His voice was low, steady, and absolutely certain. "I say we make them choke on every single link." The vote was unanimous. Earth chose war. 3 months after the decree, Earth did not look like a planet that had been conquered. It looked like a planet that was getting ready to bite back. Factories that had been building cars and washing machines were now building warships and missile batteries. Universities that had been teaching poetry and philosophy were now teaching explosives and combat engineering. In every country, in every city, in every town, people who had never held a weapon in their lives were learning how to fight. Old arguments between nations, the kind that had burned for centuries, simply stopped mattering. Russian engineers worked beside American ones. Chinese pilots trained with Indian squadrons. The flags came down, and a single new banner went up everywhere. A clenched fist, holding a broken chain. The United Earth Resistance was born, and it was angry. General Sam Hayworth set up his command center deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, buried under so much rock that even a Varathian orbital strike would have trouble reaching it. From there, he coordinated the largest military buildup in human history. Every nation gave everything it had: soldiers, scientists, engineers, hackers, mechanics, farmers who could drive heavy machinery. All of them found a place in the machine that humanity was building. Hayworth worked 20-hour days, sleeping on a cot beside his desk, eating meals he forgot the taste of before he finished them. He was not a man who inspired with grand words. He inspired by simply refusing to stop. In the classified facility beneath the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Laura Beckett was working on the weapon that might save them all. Her project, codenamed Sunfall, had been a theoretical curiosity 6 months ago. Now it was the most important piece of technology on the planet. Laura and her team had discovered something critical about Varathian shield technology. It operated on a specific energy frequency, like a radio signal. If they could build a weapon that broadcast a disruption pulse on that exact frequency, the shields would collapse. No shields meant no advantage. No advantage meant a fair fight. And Laura Beckett believed that in a fair fight, humans would win. The problem was power. The energy needed to generate a sunfall pulse was enormous, far beyond anything a single ship or ground battery could produce. Laura needed more time, more resources, and more data on how Varathian shields worked at close range. She also needed to not think about her younger brother, Matt, who had been living on the colony at Proxima Centauri when the Varathians came. Matt had been taken in the first wave of slave extractions. Laura did not know if he was alive or dead. She kept his photograph taped to her workstation monitor and tried not to look at it too often. While Laura worked on the future, Captain Danny Sutton was fighting in the present. Danny had taken his frigate and gathered 8 other ships, small, fast, and crewed by people who were either very brave or very angry, or both, and disappeared into the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. From there, he launched a guerrilla campaign against Varathian supply convoys that moved through the Sol system. His tactics were simple and brutal. He mined asteroids with explosive charges and detonated them as convoys passed. He used the dense rock fields as cover to ambush scout ships, firing everything he had and then vanishing before the bigger warships could respond. He hacked Varathian communication relays and filled them with garbage data, sending patrol fleets chasing phantom signals across empty space. The Varathians called these attacks vermin bites. They were annoyed, but not concerned. Danny Sutton was, to them, a pest, nothing more. But Danny was learning. Every engagement taught him something about how the Varathians fought, how they thought, how they reacted to surprise. He kept careful notes. He studied their patrol patterns, their communication protocols, their formation tactics. He was not just fighting a war. He was studying the enemy for the war that was coming. High Arbiter Zorath Vel, watching from his flagship in orbit above Earth, was not worried about Danny Sutton, or the Resistance, or any of it. He had crushed rebellions from species far more advanced than humans. This was routine. But he was irritated by the delay. The humans should have submitted by now. Every other species had. So, Zorath Vel decided to send a message. He ordered a punitive fleet to the human colony on Kepler 442b, a small settlement of 40,000 people on a green world 400 light-years from Earth. The colony had no military value. It was a farming community, full of families who had gone there for a quiet life among the stars. The Varathian fleet arrived in orbit and opened fire without warning. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. When it was over, there was nothing left. No buildings, no crops, no people. Just scorched earth and silence. Zorath Vel broadcast the footage to Earth, expecting terror and surrender. He got neither. The destruction of Kepler 442b did not break humanity's spirit. It set it on fire. Recruitment for the Resistance surged so fast that processing centers could not keep up. People who had been hesitant, who had thought maybe negotiation was possible, who had hoped this could be solved with words. They watched the footage of 40,000 dead civilians and they picked up weapons. Mothers who had hidden their children now enrolled them in messenger networks. Old men who had not fired a gun in decades showed up at training camps and refused to leave. The rage was not hot and wild. It was cold and deep and patient, the kind of anger that does not burn out because it has nowhere to go but forward. In this fire, a young woman named Megan Holt found her purpose. Megan was 26, a combat medic who had survived the initial Varathian ground incursion in Berlin. She had watched her entire squad die in the first 10 minutes of the invasion, cut down by plasma fire while they tried to evacuate a hospital. She had survived by hiding under the bodies of her friends and crawling through rubble for 3 hours until she reached friendly lines. Something had changed in her after that day. She did not shake anymore. She did not cry. She simply became very, very focused. The Resistance Command gave Megan a mission. A Varathian cruiser had crashed in the Sahara Desert, brought down by a lucky hit from a ground-based missile battery. The ship was mostly intact, and inside it were shield generator components that Laura Beckett desperately needed to complete her work on the Sunfall weapon. The crash site was guarded by a surviving contingent of Varathian soldiers. Megan was told to take a team of 12, get in, get the components, and get out. They crossed the desert at night, moving on foot for the last 30 kilometers to avoid detection. The crashed cruiser sat half buried in sand, its hull still glowing faintly with residual energy. Around it, Varathian soldiers patrolled in slow, confident patterns. They were not expecting trouble. Why would they be? Slaves did not attack military positions. Megan's team hit them with homemade EMP grenades first, knocking out their communication equipment and some of their armor systems. Then came chemical smokescreens that blinded their sensors. And then came 12 humans with rifles, knives, and a fury that no tactical model had ever accounted for. The fighting was close and ugly. 5 of Megan's people died getting inside the ship. In the corridors, the advantage of the Varathian size became a disadvantage. They could barely move in the tight spaces, while the humans were fast and ruthless. Megan found herself face to face with a Varathian officer, 8 feet tall and snarling. She killed him with a combat knife, driving it into the gap between his neck armor with a precision that came from weeks of studying captured alien anatomy charts. They escaped into the dunes with 7 survivors and 2 crates of alien technology that could change the war. Laura Beckett worked through the night when the components arrived. She disassembled them, studied their internal architecture, and by dawn she had done what 3 months of theoretical work could not. She understood exactly how Varathian shields maintain their coherence. She built a small prototype Sunfall emitter, aimed it at a captured Varathian shield generator, and pressed the activation switch. The shield collapsed like a soap bubble. Laura stared at the empty space where the shield had been, then picked up her communicator and called General Hayworth. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "We have it," she said. "We can kill their shields." In Cheyenne Mountain, Hayworth closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, there was something in them that had not been there before. 8 months after the decree, humanity was ready to draw blood. The target was called the Crucible, a Varathian orbital fortress the size of a small city, hanging in the dark space above Saturn's rings. It was the nerve center of all Dominion operations in the Sol system. Every order, every patrol route, every slave extraction schedule flowed through the Crucible's communication arrays. If it fell, the Varathians in human space would be blind, deaf, and cut off from reinforcements. It would not win the war, but it would prove that the war could be won. General Hayworth called the operation Broken Throne, and he gave command of the assault fleet to the one man who had been fighting the Varathians since day one. Danny Sutton, now promoted to Commodore, stood on the bridge of the Resolute and looked at the fleet he had been given. 47 ships. Most of them were civilian vessels that had been stripped down and rebuilt for combat. Cargo haulers with welded-on armor plates, mining ships with their drilling lasers recalibrated as weapons, passenger liners with their luxury cabins gutted, and replaced with missile racks. Only 11 were actual military warships, and even those were small by galactic standards. Every single ship had been fitted with the new Sunfall disruptor technology that Laura Beckett's team had spent months miniaturizing for ship-mounted deployment. It was, by any reasonable measure, a pitiful force. The Varathian defense fleet around the Crucible numbered 80 warships, each one larger and more heavily armed than anything humanity had ever built. Danny looked at his fleet and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite confidence. It was the feeling of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing he was going to jump, knowing the fall might kill him, and knowing he was going to jump anyway. He opened a channel to every ship in the fleet. "They measured us," he said. "They looked at our ships and our weapons and our bodies, and they decided we were nothing. They wrote it down in a report and stamped it with a number. Slave Category 7. He paused. "Today we teach them what nothing can do." The fleet jumped to faster-than-light speed. While the fleet was in transit, another team was already in motion. Megan Holt and a squad of 30 operators had been smuggled into Varathian space aboard a captured enemy shuttle, using stolen access codes and forged identification signals. Their mission was to dock at the Crucible before the fleet arrived, plant explosive charges on the station's primary reactor, and disable its communication array so it could not call for help. It was the kind of mission that had a very high chance of getting everyone killed, and Megan had volunteered for it without hesitation. The shuttle docked at a maintenance port on the Crucible's lower hull. The access codes worked. The airlock opened, and Megan Holt stepped onto an enemy station with 29 soldiers behind her, and enough explosives strapped to their bodies to crack the thing in half. They moved fast and quiet through the station's corridors. The Crucible was enormous, a maze of hallways, control rooms, barracks, and engineering bays. Varathian crew members passed them occasionally, and each time Megan's heart hammered in her chest. But the stolen maintenance uniforms held up. The aliens barely looked at them. Why would they? The idea that humans, slaves, would infiltrate a military installation was simply not something that occurred to them. It was like a cow walking into a slaughterhouse and picking up a knife. It did not fit their understanding of the universe. They reached the reactor level and began planting charges. That was when things went wrong. A Varathian security patrol rounded a corner and found itself face to face with Megan's team. There was half a second of frozen confusion, and then the corridor exploded into violence. Plasma bolts and human gunfire tore through the air. 3 of Megan's people went down in the first exchange. The rest fought back with everything they had: rifles, grenades, and when those ran out, fists and blades. The noise brought more Varathian soldiers, and the corridors became a running battle as Megan's team fought their way deeper into the station while planting charges as they went. Outside, Danny Sutton's fleet dropped out of faster-than-light speed near Saturn's rings, and the battle began. The Varathian defense fleet responded immediately. 80 warships turned their weapons on the human fleet and fired. The first salvo was devastating. 12 human ships were hit in the opening seconds. 3 destroyed outright. The rest crippled and burning. Varathian plasma lances cut through human armor like hot metal through paper. For a terrible moment, it looked like the battle would be over before it started. Then Danny gave the order. "All ships, activate Sunfall disruptors. Fire at will." Across the battlefield, 47 ships activated their disruptor arrays simultaneously. The effect was immediate and stunning. Varathian shields, the energy barriers that had made them nearly invincible for 12,000 years, flickered, stuttered, and collapsed, one by one, then in clusters, then all at once. For the first time in the history of the Varathian Dominion, their warships hung naked in space, and human weapons could reach them. Danny's fleet opened fire with everything it had. Kinetic rounds, missiles, laser batteries, repurposed mining charges. All of it poured into the now unshielded Varathian formation. Alien hull plating, never designed to absorb direct impacts, cracked and buckled. Explosions rippled through the Varathian fleet as ships that had never known vulnerability were torn open by weapons they had considered primitive. Fleet Lord Karath Sen, commanding the Varathian defense from his flagship, stared at his tactical display and could not understand what he was seeing. His shields were gone, his ships were dying, and the humans, the slaves, were not retreating. They were pushing forward, pressing into the gaps in his formation, firing at point-blank range where every shot was a kill. Human pilots who lost their weapons flew their crippled ships directly into Varathian cruisers, turning their own deaths into weapons. A damaged frigate, its crew already dead from decompression, drifted on autopilot into a Varathian battlecruiser and detonated its reactor, taking the alien ship with it. Karath Sen had commanded fleets for 200 years. He had fought dozens of species. He had never seen anything fight like this. These creatures did not value their own survival. They fought as if dying was an acceptable price for making the enemy bleed, and that was something his tactical training had no answer for. For the first time in 2 centuries of warfare, Karath Sen felt a cold, unfamiliar sensation crawling up his spine. It was doubt. Inside the crucible, Megan's team had planted the charges and reached the communication array. They destroyed it with thermite grenades, cutting the station off from the rest of the Dominion. But when they reached the reactor to arm the final detonation sequence, they found the trigger mechanism had been damaged in the fighting. The charges were planted, but they could not be detonated remotely. Someone would have to stay behind and trigger them by hand. Megan did not hesitate. She ordered her surviving team, 11 people, to get to the shuttle and leave. She would stay. A young private named Chris Novak refused to move. He was 23, with sandy hair and a quiet voice, and the kind of stubbornness that showed up in the way he set his jaw. "You're not staying," he said. "That's an order, Private." Chris looked at her for a long moment. Then he grabbed her by the arm, shoved her toward the corridor, and pulled a jury-rigged transmitter from his vest, something he had built during the shuttle ride, just in case. "I can trigger it from the escape pod bay," he said. "It'll work. Probably. Go." Megan wanted to argue. There was no time to argue. She ran. Chris Novak made it to the escape pod bay, aimed his transmitter at the reactor level, and pressed the button. The charges detonated. The Crucible's reactor went critical. Chris had just enough time to shove Megan's escape pod out of the launch tube before the station began to tear itself apart. He did not make it to a pod himself. The Crucible exploded with a light so bright it was visible from Earth. The Varathian defense fleet, already reeling from the loss of their shields, fell into complete chaos without their command station. Danny Sutton pressed the attack without mercy. By the time the surviving Varathian ships managed to retreat to faster-than-light speed, 60% of their fleet was destroyed, or drifting dead in Saturn's rings. The battle was over. Humanity had won. The cost was 19 ships and thousands of lives, including Chris Novak, who had been 23 years old and had never been in a real battle before that day. That night, across every human world and station and ship, people looked up at the stars and felt something they had not felt in 8 months. They felt like they might actually win this thing. And in a dark room on a distant flagship, High Arbiter Zorath Vel read the battle report and felt something the Varathian Dominion had not felt in 1,000 years. He contacted the Emperor and requested the one weapon that had not been used in living memory, the Grand Armada, 10,000 warships, the hammer that erased civilizations. The humans, Zorath Vel said quietly, require extinction. The news traveled faster than light. 14 months after the decree, Every corner of the galaxy knew what had happened at Saturn. The story passed through smuggler networks, stolen communication relays, whispered conversations in the dark corners of slave quarters on 1,000 worlds. The humans had fought back. The humans had won. The Crucible, a Varathian military fortress that was supposed to be untouchable, was dust and scrap metal floating in Saturn's rings. And the shields, the legendary Varathian shields that had kept the Dominion invincible for 12,000 years, could be broken. For the enslaved species of the Varathian Dominion, this was not just news, it was an earthquake. On the mining world of Dreth 4, deep underground, a species called the Vellani put down their tools. The Vellani were small, insectoid creatures, with 6 legs and compound eyes that glowed amber in the dark. They had been mining ore for the Dominion for 3,000 years. Generation after generation, born into the tunnels, living and dying without ever seeing the sky. On the day the news arrived, they simply stopped working. Every Vellani on the planet, millions of them, stood still and silent in the dark. The Varathian overseers screamed orders. The Vellani did not move. It was the first work stoppage in the history of the Dominion, and it was terrifying in its quietness. On the agricultural planet of Sora Prime, the amphibian Keth people, gentle, wide-eyed beings who had been growing food for the Dominion for centuries, burned their overseers' communication towers in the night. On a gladiatorial world called the Crucible of Ash, a warrior species known as the Draxarai turned on their captors during an arena match, tearing through Varathian guards with their bare hands and seizing the weapons vault. On a dozen other worlds, the same story played out in different ways. Slaves who had been broken for generations suddenly remembered that they had once been free. The Varathian Dominion was cracking, and the cracks were spreading. On Earth, General Sam Hayworth knew that the real test was coming. Intelligence extracted from captured Varathian data cores had confirmed what he feared. The Emperor had authorized the Grand Armada. 10,000 warships, plus troop carriers, supply vessels, and planet cracker siege engines capable of shattering a world's crust. It was the largest military force the galaxy had ever assembled, and it was aimed directly at Earth. Estimated arrival, 6 months. 6 months to prepare for the end of everything. Hayworth gave Laura Beckett a new assignment. The ship-mounted Sunfall disruptors had worked beautifully at Saturn, but they would not be enough against 10,000 ships. Laura needed to think bigger. She proposed something she called the Prometheus Array, a network of massive orbital emitters positioned around Earth, Mars, and the asteroid belt, capable of projecting a sunfall pulse across an entire star system. One activation, and every Varathian shield in the Sol system would collapse at the same time. The engineering challenge was enormous. The energy demands were beyond anything Earth's reactors could produce. Laura proposed a solution that made the other scientists in the room go pale. She wanted to use the sun itself as a power source. Solar siphon satellites, deployed in close orbit around the sun, would harvest energy directly from the star and beam it to the Prometheus Array. The margin for error was essentially zero. A single miscalculation would destroy the satellites and leave Earth defenseless. Laura did not care about the risk. She cared about her brother Matt, who was somewhere in the Dominion, alive or dead. She cared about the 40,000 people who had died on Kepler 442b. She cared about every human being who had been dragged onto an alien transport ship and never seen again. She deployed to a solar observation station and personally supervised the satellite installation, enduring radiation levels that the medical team warned would take years off her life. "Then, I'll work faster," she said. While Laura built the weapon, Danny Sutton was given a different kind of mission, one that required diplomacy instead of guns, though he brought the guns anyway. Hayworth sent him beyond human space with a small squadron of 5 ships, navigating through hostile Dominion territory using captured star charts. His mission was to find the rebellious slave species and offer them an alliance. It was the most dangerous assignment of Danny's life, and it had nothing to do with combat. He was asking species who had been enslaved for centuries to trust a race they had never met, to fight alongside creatures they had no reason to believe in. Danny had no grand speeches prepared. He had no political training. He was a warship captain with grease under his fingernails and a straightforward way of talking that either made people trust him or made them think he was stupid. On Dreth 4, he met the Vellani resistance leader, a being called Chitter Ka, who communicated through rapid clicks and bioluminescent flashes that Danny's translator struggled to keep up with. Chitter Ka was suspicious. Why should the Vellani trust humans? Humans were new to the galaxy. Humans might win their own freedom and leave everyone else in chains. Danny listened to the translation and nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "You've got no reason to trust us. We showed up 5 minutes ago, and we're asking you to bleed with us. That's a big ask. But I'll tell you this. We didn't start this fight because we're brave. We started it because we're angry. And angry people don't stop until the thing that made them angry is gone. Not just for us, for everyone. Fight with us, and when this is over, no one wears chains. That's not a promise from a government. That's a promise from me." Chitter Ka studied him with those glowing amber eyes for a long time. Then the Vellani leader extended a thin, chitinous limb. Danny took it and shook it gently, and the alliance was born. Over the following weeks, Danny visited 7 worlds. Each meeting was different. The Keth were shy and frightened, but offered something invaluable. Biological compounds that could corrode Varathian hull alloys, eating through alien metal like acid. The Vellani, who had spent 3,000 years inside Dominion facilities, provided detailed blueprints of military installations, supply routes, and fleet formations. The Draxhari, massive, scarred, and grim, simply wanted to fight. Their leader, a one-eyed warrior named Grath, gripped Danny's hand hard enough to bruise, and said a single word that the translator rendered as "together." The coalition was fragile. It was under-equipped. It was held together by desperation and a shared hatred of the beings who had crushed them all. But it existed, and that was a miracle in itself. Back in human space, Megan Holt was fighting the war on the ground. Promoted to lieutenant after the Crucible mission, she led resistance operations against Varathian occupation forces on the outer colonies. On Saturn's moon Titan, she organized an uprising among enslaved human laborers. She smuggled weapons into the labor camps over 3 weeks, moving them in food containers and medical supply crates. When the signal came, 4,000 workers turned on their captors simultaneously. The battle for Titan lasted 16 hours. It was fought in the corridors of mining facilities, in the frozen tunnels beneath the moon's surface, in the amber light of methane fires that burned without oxygen through chemical reactions the miners had rigged as weapons. Megan was at the front of every push, every charge, every desperate holding action when the Varathians counterattacked. She fought with a controlled violence that frightened even the soldiers who fought beside her. When the Varathian garrison commander finally fell, brought down by a grenade, Megan rolled under his command vehicle. The remaining alien soldiers surrendered. It was the first time Varathian soldiers had ever surrendered to humans. The Dominion's response to the spreading rebellion was exactly what everyone expected: brutality. A punitive fleet was sent to the Keth homeworld of Sora Prime and began orbital bombardment. Millions died. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to craters. The intent was to terrify the other rebel species into obedience. It failed completely. The massacre at Sora Prime became a rallying cry. Species that had been hesitant to join the coalition now pledged everything they had. The Dominion's strategy of fear, which had worked for 12,000 years, had finally met something it could not break. Rage that had nothing left to lose. 6 weeks before the Grand Armada's estimated arrival, the Prometheus array was completed. Laura Beckett, thin and exhausted, and carrying enough radiation damage to concern every doctor who examined her, returned to Earth and watched the final calibration tests from Cheyenne Mountain. The array worked. When it fired, every Varathian shield in the system would fall. Then the long-range sensors confirmed what they already knew. 10,000 red dots on the star map, moving toward Earth like a slow tide of blood. General Hayworth looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at the faces around him. Danny Sutton, appearing via hologram from deep space. Laura Beckett, pale and steady. Megan Holt, hard-eyed and ready. Dozens of others who had given everything and were prepared to give more. "They're bringing 10,000 ships to erase us," Hayworth said quietly. "Let's make sure they remember what it cost." They came to kill a world. 20 months after the decree, the Varathian Grand Armada entered the Sol system like a plague made of metal. 10,000 warships, arranged in a formation that stretched across millions of kilometers. A wall of death so vast that sensors could not display it on a single screen. Behind the warships came the support vessels, the troop carriers, and 3 Planet Cracker siege engines, each one a weapon designed for a single purpose, to split a world open like a broken egg. The formation moved slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of a force that had never lost. On the bridge of the Emperor's flagship, the Eternal Dominion, the largest warship ever built, bristling with weapons that could level continents, High Arbiter Zorath Vel stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and watched Earth grow larger in the viewport. He felt nothing. This was extermination, not war. The humans had been amusing in their defiance, but the game was over. In a few hours, Earth would be a graveyard, and the Varathian Dominion would continue as it had for 12,000 years, eternal, supreme, and unchallenged. He was wrong about all of it. Earth was waiting for them. The Prometheus array hung in orbit, a ring of massive emitters circling the planet like a crown of silent guns. 300 human warships were positioned in defensive formations around Earth, Mars, and the asteroid belt. Every ship was armed with sunfall disruptors and crewed by volunteers who had written their last letters home before launch. Behind the warships, hundreds of civilian vessels had been converted into fireships, packed with explosives and programmed to fly on autopilot into the heart of the enemy fleet. The asteroid belt had been turned into a minefield so dense that navigating through it would be like running through a forest of razors. And on Earth itself, every ground-to-orbit missile battery on the planet was loaded, armed, and aimed at the sky. Humanity had turned its entire solar system into a weapon. But the real surprise came from the flank. As the Grand Armada approached the orbit of Jupiter, 400 ships dropped out of faster-than-light speed on the Armada's left side. They were a ragged, mismatched collection. Stolen Varathian cruisers, with alien markings scratched off and replaced with crude symbols of defiance. Ancient warships that species like the Draxari had hidden in asteroid caves for centuries. Civilian transports, armed with whatever weapons could be bolted to their hulls. The Coalition fleet, 7 species, 400 ships, held together by fury and a shared promise. Danny Sutton stood on the bridge of the Resolute and opened a channel to the Varathian flagship. His voice was broadcast across every frequency in the system. "You came to enslave a species," he said. "You're about to fight a galaxy." The battle began. The Grand Armada split its forces, the main body driving toward Earth, while a detachment of 2,000 ships turned to engage the Coalition fleet. The first minutes were pure chaos. Varathian plasma lances filled space with streaks of white fire, carving through ships on both sides. The human fleet took devastating losses in the opening exchange. Dozens of ships destroyed in the first salvo, their crews dying in explosions that bloomed and faded in the vacuum like terrible flowers. The coalition fleet fared no better, losing ships by the score, as the Varathian detachment brought overwhelming firepower to bear. But the humans and their allies did not break. They pushed forward into the fire, closing the distance to ranges where the Varathians' superior targeting systems lost their advantage, and the fighting became close, brutal, and personal. Danny Sutton led his squadron directly into the teeth of the Varathian formation, weaving between enemy warships so close that his bridge crew could see the alien gun turrets tracking them through the viewports. At that range, every shot was a hit, and the humans made every shot count. On the far side of the battlefield, Megan Holt was leading a mission that was either brilliant or insane. A Varathian dreadnought had broken through the outer defense line and was driving toward Earth, its weapons already charging for orbital bombardment. Megan's team, 200 Marines, Human, Draxhari, and Keth, launched from a carrier ship in boarding shuttles and hit the dreadnought's hull like a swarm of hornets. They cut through the outer plating with breaching charges and poured into the ship's corridors. The fighting inside was savage. Varathian soldiers filled the hallways with plasma fire, and Megan's Marines answered with bullets, blades, and acid grenades provided by the Keth. The Draxhari warriors fought with a joy that was almost frightening, tearing through alien soldiers with clawed hands and roaring in a language that needed no translation. Megan moved through the ship like a ghost with a rifle, clearing room after room, corridor after corridor. She reached the bridge, kicked open the door, and shot the dreadnought's commander through the head before he could finish reaching for his sidearm. Megan turned its guns on the nearest Varathian cruiser and blew it in half. Then General Hayworth gave the order that changed everything. The Prometheus array activated. The solar siphon satellites, orbiting dangerously close to the sun, poured energy into the array's orbital emitters in a surge that made every sensor on every ship in the system scream with overload warnings. A wave of sunfall energy exploded outward from Earth's orbit, invisible, silent, and absolutely devastating. It washed across the entire inner solar system in seconds, touching every Varathian ship in range, and every single shield collapsed. 10,000 warships suddenly and completely defenseless. In the same instant, Earth's ground-to-orbit batteries opened fire. 300 human warships launched every missile they had. The fireships activated their autopilot programs and drove themselves into the heart of the Armada. The asteroid belt mines detonated in chains, ripping through Varathian formations that had been navigating the field. The coalition fleet pressed its attack on the flanking detachment with renewed fury. The Grand Armada, the most powerful military force ever assembled in galactic history, began to die. Fleet Lord Kareth Sen, commanding from the Armada's vanguard, watched his tactical display turn red. Ships were being destroyed faster than his systems could update. Without shields, Varathian warships, built for 12,000 years on the assumption that their shields would always protect them, were fragile. Their hull plating was thin. Their internal compartments were not designed to absorb impacts. Human kinetic rounds punched through them like needles through cloth. Missiles detonated inside their hangars. Coalition ships swarmed damaged vessels and tore them apart with concentrated fire. Kareth Sen ordered a retreat, but Danny Sutton had planned for that. The coalition fleet had maneuvered during the battle to cut off the primary escape vectors. The Armada was boxed in, trapped between Earth's defenses and the coalition's blocking force. There was nowhere to run. Zorath Fel, watching the destruction from the Eternal Dominion's bridge, refused to accept what was happening. He had one final weapon, the 3 planet cracker siege engines. massive machines of war that could shatter Earth's crust and kill every living thing on the surface. He ordered them to fire. The siege engines began charging. Their energy signatures lit up every sensor in the system. On Earth, billions of people looked up at the sky and did not know that 3 weapons were about to end their world. Laura Beckett saw it. From her monitoring station, she detected the energy buildup and understood immediately what was happening. The Prometheus array could stop them. A focused burst aimed directly at the siege engines would overload their systems and destroy them. But the array had already expended most of its energy in the system-wide pulse. A focused burst would drain the solar siphon satellites completely. The array would be destroyed. There would be no second shot. Laura did not hesitate for even a second. She entered the firing coordinates, overrode every safety protocol in the system, and activated the focused burst. A beam of pure disruption energy lanced across space and struck the 3 siege engines simultaneously. Their systems overloaded. Their reactors went critical. They exploded in blinding flashes that consumed a dozen nearby Varathian warships as collateral damage. Earth was safe. The solar siphon satellites burned out one by one, like candles in a wind. The Prometheus array went dark. Laura collapsed at her station, her body finally giving in to the radiation damage she had been carrying for months. The medical team found her unconscious, barely breathing, but with a faint smile on her face. With the siege engines gone and the armada in ruins, Danny Sutton led the combined fleet in a final push toward the Eternal Dominion. The Emperor's flagship was surrounded, battered, shieldless, and alone. Danny opened a channel and offered Zorath Vel one chance to surrender. The High Arbiter's face appeared on screen. His composure was gone. His eyes were wild. "You are animals," he spat. "You are nothing. You are slaves. You don't know your place." Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then he closed the channel and gave a single order. "All ships, fire." The Eternal Dominion died over 11 minutes. Every ship in range poured fire into the flagship until its hull cracked, its reactors breached, and its corridors filled with flame. Zorath Vel died on his burning bridge, staring at a viewscreen full of fire, unable to understand how everything he believed about the universe had been so completely, catastrophically wrong. Of the 10,000 ships that had come to erase humanity, fewer than 800 escaped into faster-than-light speed. The rest were debris. The war was not over, not yet. But the Varathian Dominion's spine was broken. In the weeks that followed, the Empire fragmented. Core worlds turned on each other. Military factions collapsed into civil war. Slave species everywhere rose up, armed with weapons and courage that the Battle of Earth had given them. The Emperor, facing the total disintegration of everything his ancestors had built, sued for peace. The treaty was signed on a liberated space station. General Hayworth was there. Danny Sutton was there. Representatives of every species in the coalition were there. Slavery was abolished across all former Dominion territory. A new galactic accord was established, a coalition of free species, equal and sovereign. The Accord's first law was proposed by Danny Sutton, and it was simple. No sentient being shall ever be owned by another. In the quiet days after the treaty, the heroes of the war found their own kinds of peace. Danny Sutton visited a memorial wall on Earth, where the names of every human who died in the war were carved in stone. There were hundreds of thousands of names. He found Chris Novak's name near the bottom, the young private who had shoved Megan into an escape pod and stayed behind to blow the crucible. Danny stood there for a long time, saying nothing, letting the silence say it for him. Megan Holt went back to Berlin, where the war had begun for her. The city was being rebuilt, and she helped with the work, carrying bricks and mixing concrete alongside people who had once been refugees. She did not talk about what she had done. She did not need to. Laura Beckett recovered slowly in a hospital overlooking the ocean. The doctors said the radiation damage had taken years off her life. She told them she had spent those years well. From her window, she watched the first ships of the new Galactic Accord fleet launch from Earth's orbit. Human ships flying beside Volani ships, Keth ships, Draxhari ships, all of them carrying the same emblem, an open hand reaching toward the stars. General Sam Hayworth retired to a quiet house in the countryside. He wrote one letter, a single page, addressed to the families of every soldier who had fallen. The letter ended with 7 words that were later carved into the base of the memorial wall. They came to make us kneel. Your sons and daughters made sure we never will. The galaxy had learned a lesson written in fire and blood, and the fury of a species that refused to be broken. And those who try to force them down will be remembered only as a warning carved into the stars.